Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Yeah, Danger Zone. Exactly. We're going to talk to Boots in a second. But over the weekend, as the reporting and the rhetoric at minimum escalated between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and the West, which is really what this is. Ukraine is just a chess piece. Of course, you had the Russian ambassador to the United States make the rounds on the Sunday talkies, as did NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Here's what Stoltenberg had to say to Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation.
So our main responsibility is to make sure that all allies are safe and secure, and that we provide deterrence and defense to them. And that's the reason why we already have increased our presence, military presence of NATO forces in the eastern part of the alliance.
You'll be increasing
and also
that?
why we are ready to further reinforce that presence if there is an attack on Ukraine. This has been a crisis in the making for a long time, so therefore we have gradually increased our presence and as I said, ready to further reinforce that.
Mm-hmm. And ready for a new normal in European security, says Jans.
I think what we are now faced with is a new normal in European security. We see Russia being willing to contest fundamental values for our security by the use of force and also by the threat of the use of force. And
I always wonder what sort of the rank and file enlisted think about or think of these heads of global enterprises like Stoltenberg or previous secretaries general at NATO and UN and so forth, when their moving of chess pieces, playing real world Risk, involves implicating men and women in the armed forces in the United States and in the West in general to be the implementation tools to do the dirty work. I wonder how they interpret the diplomatic speak of people like Jens Stoltenberg. Well, let's ask one of them. He is Jim Boots Demarest. He is a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Fighter Weapons School Top Gun program, served in Desert Storm as an F-15 pilot, currently serves in a leadership position in the Florida Air National Guard. He's got a new book, Five Nickels, The True Story of Desert Storm Heroics and Sacrifice of Air Force Captain Steve Phillis. Five Nickels, the name of the book. Jim Boots Demarest, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan, thanks so much for having me this morning. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, first of all, of course, the obvious question, why do they call you Boots?
I was going to ask that, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say, every fighter pilot has a story, and mine is fairly straightforward. I showed up at my first fighter assignment at Bitburg Air Base in Germany in the mid-1980s. It was very much a go-to-war environment. The wall was up, President Reagan was in office, and there was a lot of saber rattling. And I walked into my first operational fighter squadron with a spit-shine pair of flying boots. And as soon as I arrived, I realized the error of my ways. Because nobody else had time to shine their boots. They were all preparing to fight and fly fighters over in Europe. And so they took one look at me and they said, "Nice effing boots." And although they took, thankfully, the F part out of it, I've been known as Boots ever since.
Yeah. Oh, I like it. All right, Boots, and I'm not saying that sarcastically, like your.
Can we call you Boots?
Have at it.
Yeah, your colleagues. So what about when you hear, in the context of a potential military event, the rhetoric of like a Jens Stoltenberg about war versus what you've experienced and people you served with experience, like the gentleman you wrote a book about?
Yeah, I think as service members, we do pay attention to what's going on out there, but we remain vigilant and ready, irrespective of the rhetoric that goes on out there. Because just because things are being said doesn't mean things are happening, and conversely, just because things aren't being said doesn't mean that things are not happening. And so, I think that our service members, and I've been serving for quite some time now, we take what we hear with a grain of salt, but we are always prepared and ready to execute the nation's missions, whether it's supported by the rhetoric or not. So it doesn't change our life or our approach all that much, other than we try and stay informed as things develop.
I saw, and we will get to your book too, because I want to hear the story of Steve Phillis. But just in terms of where the military is today versus when you were active duty, I saw that the sort of celebration, press release type stuff, the military, Department of Defense reporting, spent 6 million man hours on anti-racist or what we would say woke training under the Biden administration so far. 6 million man hours with, you know, Lloyd Austin and General Milley's reading list and the diversity, inclusion, equity training, and so on and so forth. And that's got to strike real fear into the hearts of the Chinese communists, don't you think?
Well, our military, irrespective of how we're training for some of these ancillary issues, does strike fear into the hearts of our adversaries, and we are and remain the world's strongest military. We've been doing training of a lot of different types for years and years. So ancillary training and additional duties and dealing with other issues not directly relevant to the application of military force is nothing new to the military. And I think as we can appreciate, the issues we deal with in the military do reflect what's going on out there culturally in the United States, since we are a snapshot of what's going on out there. So, I joined in 1978, and certainly the type of training we were doing then is different, but it was a reflection of the times then. I think it will continue to do so long as we continue to recruit youngsters into our military who are dealing with a variety of issues. It's going to be an ongoing, I think, balance between striking the right tone in terms of maintaining our position as a reflection of the culture of America, but yet more importantly, being prepared to execute our nation's military operations when called upon.
But do you think if you focus too much on social issues, it would affect the way they perform on the battlefield?
There's no question that time is the most valuable resource that we have, and so I can tell you that we maintain focus on those combat skills that are necessary, and so really what happens is that for non-combat related training, it's just a matter of taking away from one thing and adding to another. I agree that if we spent too much time away from our combat effectiveness, our military readiness would suffer. But our military leaders are charged with being, number one, ready to go. And so none of us are going to be put in a position where we're going to, exchange combat capability for something that doesn't equate to combat power. And so I'm well aware that there's a balance to be struck. And I think I rest assured as I come to the end of my military career that our leaders going forward will continue to make sure that we're spending the right time, making sure we're ready for the really important missions.
I hope. Tell us about the book. This is the story of Air Force Captain Steve Phillis, who was, I know, somebody you served with. Who was he, and why did you want to write a book about him?
Well, thank you. Steve was from Rock Island, Illinois, so he had a great Midwestern upbringing. He was the oldest of 5 kids, and he was taught, I think, the kind of values that are emblematic of the type of values of people we still look for to bring towards the military. Sportsmanship mattered to his family. Working hard, doing the right thing the right way were really important. And Steve came from Rock Island and arrived at the Air Force Academy in 1978 when I did. And he and I were exposed to a training program designed to break us down as civilians and bring us into the family that is the military in the United States Air Force. And he was a very serious guy, very dedicated, and he thrived at the structure of the Air Force Academy because he had a burning desire to serve his country.
Wow.
And did either of you get to make time with Kelly McGillis by any chance? No.
No, actually, I was a fighter pilot when that movie came out, and so it was a great time to be a fighter pilot. But no, we were too busy preparing for the real thing to be involved in the Hollywood aspect of it. But I will tell you, it was great to be a fighter pilot in the early 80s when the movie came out. And
then Desert Storm in the early 90s, and what happened to Captain Phillis during Desert Storm in his service?
Steve was an experienced A-10 fighter pilot stationed at Myrtle Beach when Saddam Hussein's Republican Guards crossed into a little country that none of us had heard of at the time called Kuwait. And Steve was one of the first pilots forward deployed and was set up first in Desert Shield in the summer of 1990, and then as the most experienced A-10 fighter pilot in his squadron, was set up to lead the squadron's very first combat mission when Operation Desert Storm kicked off in January of 1991. Steve was paired with the most junior wingman in his flight, Lieutenant Rob Sweet, and they flew their first 30 combat missions together. The book Five Nickels focuses in on Steve's combat heroics on February 15th of 1991. And so a little over 31 years ago, Steve and Rob took off on their 30th combat mission, which was going to be by far their most dangerous mission. They were heading 100 miles north of the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border to attack Saddam's elite Republican guards. They began their attacks, they dropped their weapons, and after several attacks, Rob Sweet was shot down by an SA-13 surface-to-air missile and found himself parachuting down right on top of the Republican Guard units that he and Steve had just finished bombing. So that's the picture and sets the stage for Steve's heroics on the 15th of February. So while Rob is floating down on top of the Republican Guards, Steve gets on the radio, marks Rob's position, notes a good shoot, and begins to marshal the forces to begin the search and rescue efforts as Rob is parachuting down. He's alone, he's low on weapons, he's low on fuel, he's orbiting in a slow-moving airplane at 10,000 feet above 10,000 well-equipped, emboldened, and fairly unhappy Iraqi Republican Guard members. And I will tell you that, Dan and Amy, at this moment, Steve has earned the right to leave, but the thought of leaving never crosses his mind. Steve remains in the target area, orbits over Rob's position for 3 minutes and 45 seconds, which is an eternity in a combat situation over 10,000 well-equipped troops. And what Steve is trying to do is he's trying to bring other fighters into the area to provide top cover for Rob as he descends down over this Republican Guard unit. And unfortunately, the A-10 is not equipped with a radar, which means that Steve's comrades are not able to use the radar to find Steve. And so, in an act of selflessness and incredible heroics, Steve decides that his way of getting fighters overhead is he's going to dispense high-visibility pyrotechnic flares so that now everybody on the ground who hadn't yet seen him can now see him. Unfortunately, seconds later, Steve's A-10 is hit by a surface-to-air missile, and the aircraft is mortally wounded. And you would think at this point that Steve would turn his attention to somebody else, but that's actually not what happens. Amy and Dan, what Steve does is he gets back on the radio. He tells his friends who are inbound, hey guys, don't come here, too dangerous for you guys. And just a few moments later, his aircraft is struck by a second SA-13 surface-to-air missile, knocking the airplane out of the sky and killing Captain Steve Phillis on impact.
And you mentioned in your book that we need more role models like Steve Phillis.
Yeah, you know, and as I look around at maybe the type of people that some of us look at as role models, what I see in Steve that I find inspiring, and I think many people do, is that Steve did the right thing in the right way for the right reason. It was not for fame. It wasn't for glory. It wasn't for notoriety. Steve had made a contract with Rob Sweet, and that is, I'm going to take you into combat, and you and I are going to come home. And if for some reason you're not going to come home, I'm going to do everything under my power to make sure that you do or that you're safe. And that kind of selfless service in the face of mortal danger, with complete disregard for his own safety, not caring about the press or publicity or what people might think, is the kind of action that I want us to think about and use as an example of role model.
Amen to that. What happened to Rob?
That's a great question. So Rob had a 5-minute parachute ride down. He landed about 50 meters from a Russian-built T-72 tank, was rushed by dozens of Iraqi soldiers who beat him with hands and rifles. Had it not been for a couple of Iraqi Republican Guard officers that pulled him out of there. He may not have survived that first minute on the ground, but he was taken as a prisoner of war. He was beaten. He was tortured. He was held in isolation. But thankfully, 19 days later, on the 5th of March of 1991, Rob, along with other Allied prisoners of war, were released, and he went on to a distinguished 33-year career as an A-10 Warthog pilot, retiring just last summer.
So I think Rob would probably second your motion that that Steve Phillis should be recognized with the Medal of Honor.
Yes, as a matter of fact, when I started researching this, and the more I learned and more I thought that perhaps Steve's Silver Star should be upgraded, I contacted his family and I contacted Rob Sweet. And Rob is 110% behind the effort to upgrade Steve's Combat Valor Award. He's provided a statement in support. He's given me the inside information on what happened. He helped me tell the story of what kind of man Steve was, and the fact that Steve was fairly risk averse from a combat. So this was not a cowboy, an Iceman type of guy, racing around doing crazy things. This was a guy who took a calculated, measured risk to save another human being's life. And for that, we should not only be grateful, but perhaps as a nation should recognize him with an upgrade of the Silver Star to the Congressional Medal of Honor.
He is Jim Boots Demarest. He's a combat veteran, Desert Storm F-15 pilot. The book he wrote, 5 Nickels, True Story of the Desert Storm Heroics and Sacrifice of Air Force Captain Steve Phillis. Well, Jim, thanks so much for joining us and putting Steve Phillis on our radar. We appreciate that incredible story. Thank you for your time. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much for that. And for your listeners, I please just have them pass along the story of Steve's heroics. It's heroics worth sharing.
Okay, heroics worth sharing. Thank you so much. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Are you wondering how to grow your business? Do you need cash flow and a ready source for financing? Signature Bank can help.